Our paper is a sort of a compromise between a micro-business history and a more traditional descriptive paper. The limit on the database was, of course, that we don't have any historical time series for outward direct investment. We start having something more on inward direct investment, but our topic was Italian multinational. So I tried I will present according to this outline a short historical profile, ending with a question: why are Italian multinational latecomers? Then all protagonists and one-season protagonists, as we defined this type of case studies, and these are not really case studies, but shortly reminded why these people are, in the first case of all protagonists, still operating today as Italian multinationals, and the other people almost disappear. And finally, the fourth, capitalism. This graph gives you from the only available source so far on dating back to the early 19th century, to the early 20th century, sorry, only the number of new foreign subsidiaries, and as you see, there is a short, very few cases, as we argue here. Very few Italian companies started a deep internationalization process, I mean multinational growth, during the early phase, during the Giolittian era, and then during the interwar period we had some increasing number of foreign affiliates by companies that we could assign to the second industrial revolution. Rubber tires like Pirelli, fiber and plastics like Snia Viscosa and Montecatini, motor vehicles, Fiat, office machines, Olivetti. There was a relative peak, as you see here, in the 1930s, but this was probably a partial reaction to the weak investment, domestic demand, and also, without any rigorous proof, some consequence of the temporary appreciation of the Italian lira around quota 90. 50s and 60s, active multinational strategy by few large groups, Eni, with Agip, Olivetti, Montecatini, Snia, Fiat, Finmeccanica. They were very, very active groups, but the booming domestic market, the well-known economic miracle, and the prolonged wage moderation, in our opinion, were incentive to invest a lot in Italy, but not so much to undertake a definite multilateral growth strategy, that is foreign direct investment, FDIs. 70s and mid-80s, on the contrary, profit margins were dwindling under well-known reasons of rising wages and labor unrest, slowing productivity growth. But again, we cannot find a clear impetus to outward foreign direct investments, and indeed there were some international divestments. The reason may be the credit squeeze, restrictions on international capital movements, although these restrictions applied mainly to portfolio investments, but the general climate concerning the internationalization was not favorable, and also this creeping lira depreciation, nominal depreciation, sometimes real lira depreciation, per se was not, again, an incentive to foreign FDI, foreign acquisitions, because, as you know, a currency that depreciates make more expensive to purchase companies abroad. But also one factor that was disincentivating a clear wave of multinational growth was the big role, the heavy weight of state ownership, state-owned enterprise, ERI, FM, JP, And we submit also the abundant, rich supply of public subsidies to domestic investments, the well-known programmazione economica. All these were factors that, in our opinion, were disincentive to search for a real multinational strategy. Coming to more recent trends, since the mid-80s, we see a phenomenon of growing multinational Italian companies becoming multinational, investing abroad both by greenfields and mergers and acquisitions. So the number increased more than tenfold, as you see in the graph, the blue line. The size of employment, the yellow line, grew 4.5 times. This process of going abroad accelerated clearly in the mid-80s. The geographical shares, today this is a picture drawn from the only, should say the only one, but we make reference to the contribution to the analysis of Italian multinationals that started in the mid-80s with the contribution of our colleagues of Politecnico of Milano, reprint database. Then recently Istat started to publish, but now these data are referred to to the last available evidence. Geographical share, Europe, all the new Europe make about 2/3 of location of our outward direct investments, America 19%. And I won't dwell long on these details. Being a latecomer, if we take today stock, the accumulated investment, foreign direct investment, net of these investments, so the stock, as you see, Italy is clearly in the bottom of the ranking. Only Japan has a similar marginal role. Well, China is growing very fast, so it cannot be taken as a... Also China and Hong Kong must be taken together. So being a latecomer, the world stock, the share of the world stock today is still between 1/2 and 1/3 of the major industrial countries. And if we take the ratio of outward direct investments, these are also inward, as you see, but if you take the light blue line column, histogram, also as a percentage of GDP, Italian is in a backward position, even vis-à-vis Spain. So 27% is the ratio, or was the ratio in 2009, but this compares with Germany 41, Spain 44, France 65, UK 76. Recent trend, okay, today, let's skip over this. We have, again, this data comes from the reprint database. More than 22,000, almost 23,000 foreign affiliates, under full control, about 80%, more than 1.3 million employees, turnover for 460 billion euros. Major changes in the recent couple of decades. Well, sectoral shares, we have seen a rising share of textile, clothing and leather and declining automotive and ICT. Some of large and very large groups have disappeared or have been replaced. Just a few names: Italtel, Cragnotti, Eridania, Beginsei, GFT, the Gruppo Finanziario Tessile. These are large groups that completely disappeared. And 1/3 of medium large groups, such as Bellelli, Elfi Ocean for domestic appliances, Fochi, Sniafibre, these have disappeared. And if we take the top 15 Italian multinationals, 6 out of 15 are non-manufacturing, banking, insurance, basically, and energy, telecom. So summing up, why we think that Italy has been a latecomer as a multinational investor. First, these are all very, very well-known factors that we met several times during these couple of days of papers. Industry structure, few and decreasing large groups, both private and state-owned. So an abnormally high share of micro and small companies, which cover more than 50%, 55% of manufacturing employees. And of course, this is one major reason, because investing abroad requires a minimum size in the entry cost. 2, sectoral specialization, being specialized in consumer traditional goods and specialized suppliers in the mechanical equipment. These are all, most of these are sectors that typically, not only for Italy, but around the world, they have a high propensity to export, a much less propensity to FDI. Third, I already recalled the macroeconomic environment in the 70s and the 80s, including the unstable lira. Fourth, where we have a scale-intensive and medium high-tech sector, there is a heavy presence of state-owned enterprise and also heavily subsidized private groups, as already mentioned before. And finally, the dualistic development that for a while allowed for northern companies to have an easy supply of low-cost workers, relatively low-cost workers in southern Italy, before going around the world to look for Romanian or Chinese. Now, in section 2, you find we go quickly through a couple of the only 2 old protagonists, that is Pirelli and Fiat, and I don't have to cover all the details, but just to emphasize that Pirelli, as much as Fiat and the other people, had several attempts to undertake a multinational growth through alliances, through mergers or alliances. And these episodes are here. Pirelli Michelin in the mid-60s, Pirelli Dunlop in the 70s, with the failure of these attempted mergers. Then acquisitions, and then the failure of the acquisition with Pirelli Continental, which had a heavy cost. The Continental failure, almost $300 million at that time. Also, of course, a fierce global competition on a declining market. So the Pirelli strategy undertook a downsizing and diversifying into real estate and telecom. In the mid-2000s, the share owners decided to sell the historical, very high, quite mid-high-tech cables division to Goldman Sachs. Nowadays went to somebody else, I don't remember. Anyway, just it was a sort of a sale of a jewel. And finally, more recent years, after having bought Telecom Italia, they sold shares to the Spanish Telefonica, and they refocused on tires. And this is the new, hopefully fruitful strategy, focusing on tires, both for passenger cars and for trucks. What about Fiat? Founded at the end of the 19th century, initially export. In the early 20s, quite a substantial export growth. And they started in that period to build their own foreign sale network. In the 30s, there was this case, unique case of Fiat becoming multinational through the entry in the French market by a merger with the Simca, and then which was much later sold to Chrysler. Again, which was the experience of Fiat as a multinational player? Exploitation of the Italian market, of course, during the economic miracle, because that was the most direct available market to increasing production of various models. Then the drop of the car demand in the 70s due to the oil shocks. Research for international alliances, Fiat Citroën, which lasted more than 10 years. The breakdown of the attempted merger with Ford, that was due mainly to disagreement on control and governance. I must say, almost always the mergers fail when you come to the question of who is in charge of commanding, of having. And the more recent General Motors episode that ended with the famous General Motors paying $2 billion as a smart put option that had been put by Fiat Auto at the beginning of the agreement. Marchionne benefited from this predecessor's strategy in terms of cash. I mean, international strategy in the 1990s, the basic failure of this hopefully world car project, and nowadays the emerging Torino-Detroit axis from the general partnership from General Motors with Chrysler mergers and acquisition and strategic partnership, which may raise the question, of course, in 10 years' time, will Fiat be still Italian or American? That is an open question. One season protagonists, we have in the paper 4 examples. Just a quick hint to these large and mid-sized firms that were significant actors, even in international markets, even as multinationals, but they were able to resist, to implement their strategy, so unable to keep a sustainable growth strategy. Niche market that became inadequate to keep their multinational leadership. Some we call the curse of American dream. On the Italian-American investment in America, I apologize for not having been able to take into account the important contribution by Barbellini, Amidei, Goldstein on Italian investment in the US. This is a recent contribution in a Mimeo paper that we'll take into account in our final version. Olivetti case, almost all of you will know the story. Adriano Olivetti, expansion, 50s, 60s, far-sighted investment in the typically emerging high-growth, high-tech sector, starting from the semiconductor to computers, office machines. And so the group, at the end of the 60s, the group Italian turnover accounted for less than 20%, lower than the turnover in the US. And the group had 11 plants in Italy and 10 plants abroad. Then there was the acquisition of Underwood. Again, there is a substantial work by Barbellini and Goldstein on this case. And then came the season of the Benedetti, sale to AT&T, the crisis of the 90s. So I won't dwell on finally the final one-season protagonist, Montecatini Montedison, the chemical, Nova Monte in the 50s, merger with Edison, successful joint ventures temporarily with Highmont and Nausimont, then the takeover of Montedison, and then the exit of Montedison from the chemical industry. So, weaknesses and failure of these one-season protagonists. Well, these are just a reminder of what I have already mentioned, with failed attempts to undertake a sustainable multinational strategy. Why those failures? Well, at least 2 reasons. Perverse interference of politics, the old-fashioned political arm, with big business. This reminds our story in the 1960s. Montedison, Enimont, Siri, Teltel, Finsider, etc. Maybe the only exception is Finmeccanica, which is still today our major multinational company, but also myopia and lack of competence of the private sector. Fear of losing control. Now let's come to Let me come. How many minutes? Still 5, or did we start at 3?
Still 5 minutes.
5. Okay, fine. Fourth capitalism going abroad. Features of this fourth capitalism. First, relatively small but substantial size of turnover from 300 million to 1.5 billion for specialized suppliers of intermediate goods and equipment, such as Carraro, Mapei, I will mention later. Medium high-tech pharmaceutical turnover up to 4 to 10 billion euros in cases such as Ferrero, Luxottica, and Finmeccanica. On average, the size of this fourth capitalism is far below their major American and also European competition, which implies less ability to enter and steadily take position in fast-growing markets. Family firms, strong external managerial involvement, so family firms may be successful if they decide to become family managerial, as is the case for most of these examples of fourth capitalism. High diversification within the same fairly large niche. And also, I should insist, a genuine capability of customizing product, of being flexible enough relative to competitors such as Germans or even more Japanese. Italian ability to customize the equipment to the specific needs of the user is one of our major factor of competitiveness. Also, the motivation to become multinationals, predominantly market seeking, that is taking position in expanding market, sometimes, to use the traditional classification of determinants of FDI, knowledge resource seeking. No wonder some pharmaceutical, but also some electronic like STM or Data Logic, and even some more traditional companies such as the building material Mapei, they have some of the FDI are specifically resource seeking in terms of knowledge, investing in America or elsewhere to get knowledge useful for their own, for developing their own niche, and only occasionally cost saving. So I must correct all those that have in mind that foreign direct investments by Italy was mainly cost saving. There are cost saving investment, Benetton, Miroglio, and not only, but these are not the major determinants. The mode of multinational expansion, predominantly greenfields, but mergers and acquisitions in more recent years. Manufacturing in physical proximity to customers. This is typical of the automotive construction and engineering. Car components must be built, not only exported from Italy, but built, assembled, adapted closer to final users. Final users may also be some Fiat plant, but mostly a competitor in the car business. Strong investment in distributive networks. This is is quite crucial for traditional goods such as fashion, distribution and after-sales assistance, but also is one of the major determinants for foreign direct investments in commercial network and after-sale assistance by companies such as Indesit, DeLonghi in the domestic appliances, Danieli in the engineering, Piaggio, as we see. Finally, for fourth capitalism, characteristics of going abroad, most of them keep solid roots in their original industrial districts, and they become interesting leading movers for pulling the industrial district, projecting the industrial district abroad. Most of them are networking with polytechnics, research universities. They come to invest in R&D even 5 to 10% of turnover, which is quite respectable. And their financial structure is quite solid. Not so much bank dependent, small leverage, lot of returned earnings, zero dividends. These are common story. Not listing in the stock exchange. Some of them are listed like Luxottica, but so if I have still 2 minutes, just going through 3 examples of names that you know very well, just to give the idea of how fast was this growth of multinational companies. Ermenegildo Zegna is an old protagonist, but it became a very recent protagonist in terms of multinational growth. So they started to open production facilities in the 70s, and now they have 7,500 employees, turnover of 800 million euros, 55 exclusive stores. Luxottica, you know very well the name, Leonardo Del Vecchio, started from producing small eyewear components, then went into complete eyewear in the area of in the northeast of Italy, and then started in 81 with the first foreign direct investment, outward direct investment, commercial subsidiary. Again, you see, being consumer goods, commercial subsidiary is essential. And then went through an impressive growth of acquisition, especially in America. Now Luxottica has a turnover over $5 billion, euros, 60,000 direct employees, 6,300 stores in 5 continents. And finally, Mapei, which I like very much, is a story of a second generation multinational, started from the father of the current CEO, who is Giorgio Squinzi. The father opened 3 employee store in the 1930s, but Giorgio graduated in industrial chemicals, and then he decided to go into an aggressive strategy of multinational, not only of export, but multinational growth. Nowadays they have how can I approach the last, anyway, 7,000 employees, and I don't have the copy. Come si alza questa se voglio andare fuori dalla... Okay, anyway, they invest 5% of turnover and 12% employee. No, well, Piaggio, I'll skip over because time is short. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabrizio. Now we have Cristiano Antonelli as discussant.
15 minutes.
15 minutes.
Okay, very well. Thank you. Yes, thanks. Okay, thank you. I just need the second slide. Well, the first, if you like to. Okay, that's the first to start. Yes, that is fine. That is essentially a very brief synthesis of the paper. The point of the paper is to provide a very detailed and careful description, I would say, of those 3 waves of multinational growth of Italian firms, and to provide much evidence and attention in the analytical exam of the so-called 4th generation. And I would like the basic comment. I'm going to make 3 comments and one, and try and implement a kind of a consequence of the 3 points. The basic starting point is that maybe between the 3rd and the 4th wave, attention should be paid to something which I think is quite interesting, not obvious, and rarely stressed in the debate. That is, the former state-owned companies became multinational companies with impressive evidence, impressive figures, and I would say it's sufficient to list a few names. Enel and Eni are among the largest multinationals in the world. Unicredit, which still in the name recalls the old Unicredito, the old Credito Italiano, is among the largest Italian world banks. The same for Intesa, which you might want to remember, includes the old Banca Commerciale. Telecom Italia is almost a binational, a dual national company if you consider the importance of Latin American activities. And I can keep going on, Autogrill and Autostrade. That is, we should, and STM, which of course should be considered, and Finmeccanica. The privatization had a major consequence. That is, a group quite important of 10 to 15 companies became multinationals and are among the most important multinationals today. An important, so to say, consideration, since we have been listening a lot about the international oligopolies, is that I believe that never before Italy found herself in such a strong position in the international financial oligopoly. Unicredit, Intesa and Generali take a place in the international financial oligopoly which has not been found easily in the economic history, in the Italian economic history before. Now we should try and elaborate a bit. Why happens that these service companies become multinational companies? And that is a point which I think could be easily integrated into the paper. That is, maybe too much attention has been paid, as in many others papers in this conference, to manufacturing, while of course services are now the leading activity. So we have many leading firms in the service, in the broad category of service, financial services and communication services. The development of Autostrada and Autogrill are quite impressive. And again, we are fully in the service economy. They were mainly, all of them, I would say, and I forgot to add, of course, STM and Finmeccanica and Eni, of course. They still are, to some extent. STM, Finmeccanica, Eni, and Enel are still not longer state-owned, but indeed state-controlled. So we have former state-owned companies which grow and become multinational companies in service industries. And I was not able to gather all the figures, but the size of the FDI of these companies and the size of stock of capital invested abroad is far larger than the fourth generation, which attracted so much attention. So we have something between the third and the fourth generation, which is indeed relevant and warrants attention. Second, a point which I would like to see in the further implementation of the chapter is the distinction between multinational and global companies. And that is a basic difference. Multinational companies grew into, or many multinational companies grew into global companies. And now the distinction is quite important. A multinational company, of course, is organized above a production which is abroad, which is eventually used to substitute exports and even eventually imports from the home country. A global company is completely different. It's a company which conceives products at home, manufactures them abroad, imports the production back home, and takes care of the distribution. So the global corporation no longer manufactures at home, manufactures only, I would say, abroad, retains at home master plans, that is, those where the first implementation of the new products and processes is implemented and engineered, and eventually they become plants abroad. I believe that the notion of global corporation is essential, first of all, to understand what's going on with the old players, I think was the name, that is Fiat and Pirelli. Pirelli is a perfect example of a global corporation. They retained one plant in Settimo Torinese, nearby Torino, and 12 plants everywhere, from Latin America to Eastern Europe to Asia. And it's the perfect example of a global corporation. Why is it so interesting? Not only because it helps understanding what's going on, and clearly Pirelli anticipates, I believe, what's going on with Fiat. Fiat is simply becoming a global corporation. No surprise. We have seen everything already with Pirelli. We have seen everything already with Pirelli. That is, Pirelli closed something like 7 plants in Italy in the last 15 years. And even more if you consider old Europe, closed plants in France and Spain, and now manufactures only Latin America, Eastern Europe and Russia, eventually, and Asia. So I would not be surprised. The story is Fiat going to stay Italian? No, Fiat's simply going to become a global corporation. Hopefully it's going to become a global corporation. What is a global corporation? It's a company which almost, as I stress again, doesn't manufacture at home. If you analyze the employment structure of a global corporation, it's highly skill intensive, is highly knowledge intensive. I repeat, research and development, finance, advertisement, engineering at home, manufacturing abroad, and distribution at home, and of course in the international network again. If you measure those activities, and that is why I'm so fond of the point, if you measure those activities with economic tools, you discover that the fixed capital intensity in the home country of a global corporation is very low. There's no fixed capital at work, at home. Remember, we have high levels of skill intensity at home. As a consequence, which is quite surprising, but should be kept in mind, in many papers I've been listening to, is that labor productivity falls. Labor productivity is a tragedy for, so I would say, not for, genetic economists. Why does labor productivity fall? Because you have destroyed the fixed capital. Fixed capital is in Brazil. Fixed capital is in Romania. Fixed capital is no longer in Italy. I have very clear in mind the situation of Pirelli, which I had the chance to know quite in detail. If you measure the skill intensity of Pirelli in Italy, it's astonishing. If you measure the capital intensity, it looks like a tragedy, and it is not, of course, a tragedy. If you measure labor productivity, looks a disaster, and it is not at all a disaster, because when you close a steel company and you open a software company, labor productivity is falling down. That is something which is completely missed in this conference. Labor productivity is a disaster. Again, looks like a disaster. You have only engineers paid 3 times as much as a blue-collar worker, and an endowment of fixed capital which is really negligible. Since the definition of added value, as you know, is the contribution of capital and labor, the fall in labor productivity is almost obvious. And there's no relationship whatsoever with efficiency, performances, decline, which looks like a very common point in this conference. There's no relationship whatsoever between decline and labor productivity if you do not account for changes in capital intensity, in international chain value, and in the sections of the production process which you retain at home and you spread in the rest of the world. Now let's make a step further. If I group together the former state-owned companies, which all became, did they become, that's a question, did they become multinationals or did they become global? And that's the point. That now, if you round up those and put them together, you have a sensible group, quite relevant group of large companies which became either global after a long history being multinational companies, that is clearly the case of Fiat, and in any event already the point with Pirelli, or financial and communication companies which suddenly, I would say, moved away from the old domestic markets and became global service companies with, again, the same consequences in terms of labor productivity. So I believe that this brings to the conclusion, almost in time, that from a theoretical point of view, which is useful for good applied work, is that a global company is a company I have, yes, thank you very much. It is exactly, there is another one which, why are there global corporations? Can you help me? I believe is further. If you move on the slides. The title, no, sorry, so backwards, sorry, is, okay. Why are there global corporations? And the point is, firms become global to better manage the generation, use, and exploitation of technological knowledge. And that's the point. The generation, use, and exploitation of technological knowledge. That is a global corporation. That is today what you see everywhere in the world. Multinational companies are old, guys. They are disappearing. Multinational companies were manufacturing companies. There's no longer manufacturing activity. All this conference is concentrated on manufacturing activities, which is somewhat surprising. In UK, 14% of employment. In US, 16% of employment. The famous high tech is 2% of 16. Why should you pay so much attention to a few thousand workers? And nobody talks about 80% of employment, which is services. It's really embarrassing. We're talking about old ages, as if, time never changed. We are in the 21st century, where knowledge is the basic input, because capital is abundant in China as much as in Europe. Labor is much more abundant in China than in Europe. The single true primary input, I believe, which is somewhat more abundant in Europe and on the other side of the Atlantic, is knowledge. So we shift away our specialization towards knowledge-intensive activities. And we go away from blue-collar labor-intensive activities and capital-intensive activities. Because capital is as abundant in China as in Italy. The consequence is labor productivity is doomed to fall sharply, simply because the basic production function has changed completely. Now we have K, which no longer matters. We have L for blue collars, which matters less and less. And you have technology, which it means skills. But a skill-intensive production activity, like a software company, has almost no fixed capital. As a consequence, the added value per capita, labor productivity, is really negligible. Is dramatically negligible with respect to any company, any manufacturing company. So of course you see decline, but you call it decline. This is not decline at all. It's transformation. It's transformation towards a society and economy which is knowledge-based. A knowledge-based economy which has been anticipated, I would say, some 20 years ago already by the global corporation. And if you check with the American multinationals, they are global corporations, they manufacture in South China, and at home, engineers, financial experts, advertisers, and marketing people. Skills, no capital, dramatic levels of labor productivity, high levels of efficiency and performance. It is not decline, it's progress. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Now we can take questions. Yes, Giovanni?
I'm forced to intervene and disagree with it's too juicy a chance. In defense of manufacturing and also challenging your statement on productivity. Now, it's not at all certain that the type of restructuring that you are talking about induces a fall in value added simply because the people that remain at home are engineers, managers, financial crooks, etc., that gain an enormous amount of money, and all disappears as value added because they don't have any material input. So it's very difficult to say what happens in terms of per capita value added if you disintegrate the manufacturing and you put somewhere else. Essentially because the wage of the worker is much lower of blue-collar worker, and the capital provision that you would equate more or less with gross profit margin might not compensate the fact that you've got in Turin Marchionne that appears for 2/3 of what he takes home appear as salary. And appearing as salary appears as value added. So I'm not at all sure that that type of disintegration statistically induces what you're saying. It'd be interesting. I mean, now Istat is in the position of reconstructing different degrees of vertical disintegration. This is indeed an interesting question, but there is no obvious answer to that. I mean, my prior will be the other way around. But you say one should look at services. I mean, why does one look typically at manufacturing? Because along with Marxian, Smithian, Kaldorian line, that was a major source of increasing returns. There are, I agree with you, there are part of services that are increasing return services, for sure. Software is one of them. Don't forget that in the US, the fastest growing profession in services have been janitors, guards, other personal services. The service, and this is obviously favored by societies in which income distribution become more and more skewed, precisely because you have got the Walmart that produce in China. And so they eliminate the good jobs, the good worker and middle classes jobs in the United States, or increasingly in Italy.
Thanks. It's really an excellent paper. I have a few points to raise. One is the role of Italian diasporas in early phases of internationalization of Italian companies, and something that maybe deserves to be treated, especially in the case of Argentina, Latin America more generally, but also in the case of the United States, and that has to do with the manufacturers. But in fact, there is a rich literature now using gravity equations, which of course in the case of Italy would be difficult because we don't have the bilateral flows, but still there is more than anecdotal information on this. A second point which is related is that I think there are some examples, which at least some that I found, where in the case of Argentina, for instance, of a more kind of early fourth capitalism and multinationals already in the 50s and 60s going there. In fact, I think that the Acocella database you use tends to underestimate the number of Italian firms with production facilities overseas. Also on another dimension of fourth capitalism, I think the experience, much more recent experience of the industrial districts, especially from northeast Italy, that kind of moved to Romania or to Slovakia. It's also a very interesting dimension of internationalization, which, by the way, you don't find almost by definition in countries like France or the UK, where you don't have the industrial districts. So it's a form of not so light FDI, which also is interesting. Another one, which again is in line with the literature in international business, is the born global. And I think there are more and more examples also of Italian born globals, especially again in the fourth capitalism, almost by definition. Looking at the first capitalism, and the Fiat or the Pirelli cases. Again, going back to the issue of Mediobanca, I think that if Mediobanca probably played a role in determining the size of companies in Italy in the 50s and 60s, it played an even greater role in sometimes, I guess, even in preventing Italian companies from thinking of going international, and probably providing not so good advice in some examples. I think, in particular, in the case of Pirelli Continental, there is, I guess, evidence that they provided the bad advice, or simply they didn't have the cognitive instruments to provide the good advice. Of course, it was very inward-looking at the time. Another point has to do with the other dimension of internationalization, not only sales, assets, and employment, but also, in particular, I think of managerial structures and corporate governance. I think there is evidence that the Italian boards tend to have many fewer foreigners than in comparable European countries. Italian managers tend not to sit on the boards of foreign firms, which of course is very important because it's the corporate network that creates the opportunities and transmits the information that is necessary. And the other dimension, of course, is that there are very few foreign-born CEOs in Italian firms. In fact, I think Campari is probably the only one. I mean, of course, Marchione is now probably more Canadian or American than Italian, but I think that that level of internationalization is also important. And then the last point, I think, has to do more generally with the economics of outward FDI, and I think there are now some studies, I think in particular work by Lucia Piscitello on the OFDI employment nexus, which maybe are worth mentioning in the paper. And then the last point, on the point raised by Cristiano, I wouldn't be so sanguine about the fact that it doesn't really matter where the headquarters is, which is an issue more for inward FDI, but of course in the case of a crisis it may be kind of an outward, a reversed outward FDI, where at the end actually the headquarters moved to Detroit. I wouldn't be so sure. I think there is literature in the case of Sweden showing that when the headquarters move overseas, there are some core high quality functions, but I guess John is in a much better position to confirm or not this, or so Francesca. I think that there is a literature which shows that in fact when you lose the nationality, there are some not so positive implications, which of course goes a bit against the mantra, but maybe is a point worth raising again in this issue also, because I think inward and outward it becomes much more difficult to separate the two phenomena.
Well, thank you very much. It's a very interesting topic. I think that looking at the history of Italian development through its multinational expansion is an extremely fruitful perspective, because we capture many of the essential features of Italian development. The history of Italian multinational is a history of discontinuity, as you said, and I think that is a very important point to underline. I think that it would be interesting to highlight a little more the pattern of Italian foreign expansion that initially versus Latin America, only later towards Europe and then towards United States. Italian multinational have been follower not only in becoming multinational, but also in the type of strategies they were adopting. So it will be interesting to see if that is still the case. Trade and FDI, in the late 80s, the pattern of Italian trade and Italian foreign production were quite disjoint. Foreign direct investment were in scale-intensive sector, trade was in traditional sector. From what you're saying, Italy is becoming more normal because the pattern of foreign direct investment is becoming more similar to the pattern of Italian export. I think it is another point that would be interesting to underline. Cristiano attracted attention to the very important point, the relation between multinational and technology. The history of Italian multinationality is linked to the history of the lack of innovation activity in Italy. And the two things are strictly connected, and it will be quite important to capture the interaction between these two phenomena. So I think it's very important that you brought to light. I think that Cristiano in his presentation was a bit too extreme in terms of the global corporation. I just would like to call attention to the fact that there is a very recent report of the Boston Consulting Group saying that now the recent trend is reshoring of global corporation, bringing back to the home country part of the production. So let's try to see that the reality is much more complex. Thank you.
I have a suggestion and a comment. The suggestion is that I quite like what the overall setup of the paper, that you've combined on the one hand the overall statistics on direct investment with some case study, business history evidence. But my suggestion would be, if you can, to try and integrate those a bit better. It may be that I haven't yet read the paper sufficiently thoroughly, but at least in the presentation I thought those two parts were a little disconnected from one another, and perhaps if you could develop some stories or themes that come out of the case studies that you can then relate back to the descriptive evidence of the data, I think that would be, it would give the overall chapter a kind of more cohesive feel. Secondly, which is the comment which picks up a bit from what Cristiano was suggesting, nowadays we've tended to move our definition of what is a multinational firm. So traditionally a multinational firm was defined in relationship, rather like direct investment, to patterns of ownership and control of assets. But increasingly now, we're defining a multinational firm by virtue of the orchestration of an international business network, which means not necessarily just those assets that are owned and controlled, but those activities that in some sense are orchestrated by some central organisation in the form of the multinational firm. And both in terms of what's owned and what's part of the wider network, there's therefore a wider distribution. This is one of the points Cristiano was making, a wider distribution of points of knowledge and power within the firm and within the wider network. And so this implies a rather different position in terms of the transformation of the entity itself, the evolution of the entity itself as a multinational firm. But one issue that this then raises is that, of course, maybe direct investment data are no longer entirely sufficient to analyse. In a sense, there's then a disjuncture between the data on direct investment and the data on firms and firm activity, which would therefore range rather broader than just the ownership and control of assets as defined by direct investment. So I don't know whether one would want to pick that up in the paper, but it would be perhaps, if Cristiano's points are taken on board, a kind of reflection on how there's been this transformation, certainly over the 100-year period, but particularly in the post-war years, in the nature of the multinational firm as an organisation.
Struggling with the minutes because I start with from our discussant Cristiano. Service, okay, we excluded and we are aware that we should take care of Enel, Telecom, Autostrade. That is, of course, one important item of. Second point, the size of the old protagonist is still today greater than the size of the fourth capitalism. Agree, I never meant the opposite. I was referring to the shares. So the fourth capitalism increased its share on overall foreign direct investment by Italy.